Okay, welcome back everyone to another video. And today we're going to talk about creation versus consumption. And we're really going to dive into an interesting topic that a lot of people don't talk about. And that is called emotional logic. So a lot of time, creation versus consumption, right? A lot of people think of them as opposites. And when people think of someone being emotional, it's funny because I've been hearing this word used a lot, and I realize I don't understand the context because I view it fundamentally differently. And people use it as though emotion and logic are these diametric opposites. And today I'm going to talk about and demonstrate that in fact, emotions are logical and that all logic is emotional and that they're actually combined and work together to create the same effect. And so, in order to do that, though, we have to understand the difference between creation versus consumption and why that matters. Because if we don't set that as a standard first, then obviously it's easy to fall into the path, the trap of thinking that they're different, right? And I realize it's not seeing that connection. So let's talk about really what we mean let's define terms first, because that's always what we're doing, right? So we have to define creation, logic, consumption, and then creation, and then emotional, right? So let's get our terms right first. So first we have creation. So creation, I would say, is the organization of unlike elements into a cooperative system. I know that might seem very technical, but I think that is the best way to explain creation, because when we create something, we're not actually creating anything. Nothing can be created nor destroyed in the truest sense of the word. So what we're doing is, when we create something, what we're doing is we're taking a bunch of unlike elements and putting them together into a cooperative system, right? And so a good example would be like this marker, right? So this marker is ink, it's plastic, it's felt, so a bit of paper. It's a bunch of these unlike elements that would not naturally come together, right? And they're unlike elements, but then they've been placed together and they've gone through a process and they've been organized in such a way that they now work into a cooperative system, this marker, right? Another good example is like this easel, right? It's wood, nails that have been organized in such a way to hold stuff up, right? The phone you're talking to me on, is literally thousands of natural materials that would never naturally come together and create a system, right? And so the idea is that they have to come together in an organized manner and create a cooperative system. So now we see that there's something inherent about this, right? Because when we talk about something being creation versus existing and natural versus unnatural, I really want to talk about this idea of organization and this idea of cooperative. So the idea is that really when these things come together is that they're brought together by some level of intelligence, right? Because as we said, you could take all the felt, rubber, ink, all the elements that make these things, right? And these are unrefined elements. You could take all these things, smash them together in natural courses of the universe, but they would never create this pen. Yet now we have, I have, 7 of them right here with me, right? In different colors, different shapes, right? Because of a governing intelligence. Our intelligence was able to bring these unlike elements together into a cooperative system, this pen, so that it could work with this whiteboard to work and create a system, right? And so a system is just, and then, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of defining all these words because we're really focusing on creation, so a system is just something that achieves a result, right? And so this is the creation. That in order to organize, in order to bring something into cooperation, we have to have intelligence, right? And the idea is like that when things naturally work together, especially when they're unlike elements, that is governed by intelligence, right? Because things that are unlike naturally don't cooperate. They naturally do not move into a system where they work together. But we see that just in the case of this marker, when intelligence governs these unlike elements and brings these things cooperative, creation happens, or therefore a cooperative system takes place, right? Then you could talk about like the cosmos, the universe, the earth, and yeah, that's when we start getting into higher intelligence and all that stuff, but that's not what we're talking about right now. Let's just focus on the idea that in order for something to be created, it needs to have a governing intelligence, right? Now, talking about consumption, consumption is when basically one element destroys another for preservation. Right? So destroys means to obviously disorganize, bring that out of existence, right? So an element being like, you could talk about, saying a lion consumes a deer, right? And they destroy the deer for preservation. It's eating it, right? And so the idea is that consumption is happening is because something is feeding on something else for its own preservation. This is key, right? Because this is also now this you could talk is an intelligence, but because it's non-organizational, we'll see that things like fire and ice, naturally we see that things tend to move towards entropy or chaos, right? That's the law of entropy. And so that the world is that we see that when we leave things, that there naturally come these elements that destroy one another, where the more powerful elements will begin to destroy the lesser elements. So until, they naturally move into balance with one another, right? And that's because there's a higher governing intelligence, but we don't need to get all the way into that. But essentially, consumption is one element destroys another for preservation. So if you understand what the basis of these two basic elements are, creation versus consumption, we see that they both work together in a cycle, right? And this is like, you could call it like the circle of life, right? Like Lion King, lion eats the antelope, antelope eats the grass. Grass is, what is it? No, so the lion eats the antelope, dies, becomes one with the grass, antelopes eat the grass, and then they become part, and it's all part of the circle of life, right? So it's just this idea that we're all part of this cycle of life. And that's really important. So we see that creation and consumption work in a cooperative cycle. And there's a lot of ways to view that cycle, which we'll talk about. But ultimately, it's recognizing that these things are ultimately like, that the system, even with consumption, is fundamentally cooperative because there's a governing intelligence behind all of it, right? And so now we'll then define other terms, right? We're going to talk about emotional. Yeah, let's do this. Let's do emotional. So a lot of people use this word to meaning people are acting based in emotions and not logic, and they're allowing their emotions. This is about expression, where because we're in a very masculine society, where society we've deemed that when one expresses their emotions, that they're acting. We use words like irrational, or what's another word we use? We use emotional. We say that they're out of control, right? Things like that. And it's because as a society, we've become obsessed with non-emotional expression, right? So we say when you have emotional expression, you're emotional. And we often use this as to degrade other people when we say that, okay, you're expressing your emotions, therefore you're irrational, you're out of control, something like that. When all emotion is exactly that. Emotional is just expressing emotion, right? But the problem is when you live in a society where you just express emotions. But when you live in a society where expressing emotions is not wanted or not needed, what happens is those emotions go unexpressed. And so we move into like a more stoic manner. Now, it doesn't mean the emotions go away, they just go unexpressed. So this creates suppressed emotions. But once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about that in a second here. But defining another term, let's talk about logic. Now, to define logic is basically a system. Now you can look it up on Google. I probably should have looked it up on Google, but the way I would define logic is a system of conclusions based in cooperative phenomena. Because I can't spell phenomena, what the heck? I gotta work on my spelling. Anyway, so system of conclusions based in cooperative phenomena, right? So basically what logic means is because this happens, therefore this happens, therefore this happens, based in cooperative phenomena and the laws of that phenomena, right? So the phenomena being like the elements, right? The phenomena being like what happens when the elements coincide, right? So a good example is like if I walk off a cliff, the logical conclusion is that gravity is going to pull me down, right? Unless of course there's a platform underneath that cliff, in which case I'll be pulled down in as much until the platform stops me. But the idea is that the laws never stop in play, but there's always additional elements to change the conclusion that we draw based on logic. So logic is understanding how certain elements, the nature of elements, how the nature of elements work together, right? And so oftentimes we have steps in logic when we do not understand the nature of a phenomenon. This is what happens, or the nature of an element. And therefore, when we don't understand the nature of an element, we don't know what phenomena would occur when those encounter. And that's why we use words like irrational and out of control when we talk about emotions. Because in general, as a whole, as a society, I would say most people do not understand what emotions are or their function. We've just kind of said, emotions bad, not good, and then just kind of thrown them off there. And we don't understand that actually emotions are based in logic, right? And that they work there. But the problem is that we have, as a society, embraced suppressed emotions, right? And when we have suppressed emotions, a lot of nasty stuff begins to happen. And the thing is, we're so bad where we're not bad, but because I don't really like that word bad, but relatively, our understanding of emotions is so weak that they still drive so much of the things we see in our lives day to day. Whether it be like major conflicts we have around the world, or we see like divorces, we see family issues, we see workplace issues, we see abuse happening all around the world, because on a fundamental level, as a society and as human beings, we have not come to understand what emotions are or how they function. But it's not that the wisdom isn't out there. It's not that we don't have the ability to, we just have not embraced that understanding. And we're stepping into it now with more emotional intelligence, more emotional maturity happening. But I would say as a society in general, we're still very emotionally immature and very emotionally unintelligent. So today, we're going to talk about where creation and consumption fits in with emotions and logic. And you might be like, why is creation and consumption important, right? And the reason that's so important in knowing is you have to understand in the cycle of life, there's a consumption phase and a creation phase. And you have to ask yourself, when we're in a particular moment, am I in a creation moment or am I in a consumption moment? Because in moments of creation is going to be built off of, so here's some fundamental keywords for creation. So creation is going to be characterized by feeling expansive, open, I could say gentle, but more like it's free and it's in alignment. This is the big one. Actually, I'm going to use a different marker because that's super important. Is that creation is fundamentally in alignment with our nature. And so the reason I'm speaking to you on the assumption that you're a human being is that human beings, we're fundamentally in alignment when we are in creation, right? Everything inside of us wants us to create, right? Take two unlike elements and move them into a cooperative system, right? And the idea we have that is because it comes back to second degree law, right? Matter and intelligence, male versus male, or masculine energy, female energy, right? Masculine, feminine, positive, negative, space, or object rather. Object, space. Just this idea that ultimately, at the end of the day, to have creation happen, we need these unlike elements to come together. So a good example of like on the most basic fundamental level. In order to write this, I have a whiteboard which would represent the feminine space, right? Then you see the letters, which is the masculine object, the masculine form, right? So you have here form and masculine, and then here within the feminine you have function, or no, masculine is the function and then feminine is the form, which allows the space to give that, right? And so here we see just an example of like, this is how these elements come together. You see a marker and you see a whiteboard, create a result, which is these words, right? And obviously we go into the words, which are like the letters, the da 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 da. This is like infinite. You can go up and down infinitely, right? But everything fundamentally works on these two basic elements. You need to understand that. And so when we have these in alignment, when we have alignment, it means we're living in line with our nature. It means human beings are doing what we're meant to do. We're meant to create. So what does creation mean as a human being? And that is because that basically means this. We're living in our lines with our spirit. Now, spirit just means that part of us, which is not physical, right? But is not the mind. And you might be like, what do you mean, not the mind? Well, we'll get there. And then there's the mind underneath that, where your thoughts exist, right? And then underneath that, all that, be smarter. We're gonna have, you could say our body, but really the body is just a representation of the temporal existence, like physical reality. So I'm gonna say the physical. Or I'm gonna use the word being, because this is important. Actually, no, I'll use the word body so you can understand that all of this represents your being as a human being, right? And recognize every single thing that exists fundamentally functions like this. Whether it's your car, your clothes, everything exists spiritually, mentally, and then has a body, a physical representation in the world, right? And the issue why we get screwed up as a society is we only acknowledge this down here. We only acknowledge the physical as reality. So we say this is reality, and then we gaslight people as a society and say this is not real. This is irrational. We call this irrational. And we say this. And then we are kind of at the place where we kind of honor thinking and ideas. We talk about ideas and thinking, and we kind of honor those, but that is what we allow expression. But we don't, as a society yet, we're not really learning, we don't really know how to. Of course, we're hyper masculine, super hyper function, that we allow this level of expression based in logic, but we don't ever allow this emotions to drive this emotion, which is why as a functionality, there's people like who are smart, say they are smart, and they can have all these great ideas, but then there's no power behind anything, and they can't really express any of these ideas because they have they're out of alignment because this part right here is suppressed. And that's where you get suppressed emotions. And when you have suppressed emotions, the emotions didn't go anywhere. They're like objects. So you gotta understand when you get to a higher degree of understanding that your body and physical objects is just these are just three-dimensional objects, right? This is just three-dimensional objects, but there's other dimensions where your thoughts exist. So this is where thinking, right? Thinking, thoughts, ideas, and other entities as well also exist. And you could call this four-dimensional, right? And then here in the spirit, this is where emotions exist. So these are things like really, really powerful emotions, feelings, right? They exist here in this higher realm, and we can call this 5D, right? And there's also entities and ideas and things that exist. Now this is the thing. Most of reality, most of what we call reality is based in here. This is like 80% of reality, right here. This is 80% of reality. So we as a society, we as human beings, when we function, we ignore basically about 80% of what is actually going on and what is actually going on. We ignore it. We completely act as though it's not real. We only focus on physical phenomena. And so now you have this like small 18% here, I'd say, which is the mind thinking ideas that come from that. And then we will actively only navigate or look at this small 2% here at the bottom. And then we tell ourselves like, oh, like we're being hyper rational because I can talk about my ideas and I can see that representation, evidence, science, everything like that. Science is what happens when we're observing science, what we're doing is we're taking our creative capacity and observing it here. But recognizing that the process of that creation started up here. So the problem is that oftentimes there's a whole process of creation that's happening that a rational, scientific, thinking mind won't acknowledge until it gets here, until they have evidence of something, right? Now the issue is that because we live in three-dimensional space and creation happens in a five-dimensional space, we live here with these constraints called time and space. Obviously, right? Time and space, right? And so and you could even go, time and space. And so because these exist within the physical world, spirit doesn't operate on that level. So once your feelings, your emotions and things, you try to put them within boxes of time and space, they don't exist there. That's why intellectually, there are some phenomena or things you can't understand. Like some people will say, well, you can't explain things like love intellectually. Of course not, right? Love is not an intellectual pursuit. It's not something that's based in the mind. It's something that's based in the spirit. It can be experienced. It can be felt. It can even be seen. But in terms of intellectual language, no one will come to a full understanding of love without feeling, seeing, and experiencing it. That's the only way it can be incorporated because it's a fundamentally spiritual experience. It's emotion. Well, it is emotional. It doesn't mean that it's an emotion, actually. It just means that it's a 5D aspect. Love is a 5D aspect, which means that in order to see it in its purity, you have to experience it on a fifth dimensional aspect, and then you'll do it in the 4D and then the 3D. And then we'll see shadows. Everything you see down here is like a shadow, right? And so in order to understand love, you have to exist and understand this emotional range. And the way to explain it, emotions, so when something is an emotion is like a thought, which is like an action, where these are things that occur within their respective spaces. So actions within the 3D, thoughts within the 4D, feelings within the 5D. These are phenomena, or things that happen, but they themselves are not the elements. So an example is that I can feel this pen, but the feeling of the pen is not the pen itself. I can feel the pen, right? I can see this color red, but see this, right, color red, I can see it, but that in and of itself is not the color, the concept of red, right? This marker is not the concept of red. I can just see it as red. I don't know if that makes any sense, right? But this is like fundamentally what I mean when I'm talking about alignment and like suppressed emotions, right? Is that you have to really understand that these are different things you're describing, and that if I want to understand actions, I have to speak the language of physicality. But in order to speak that, I have to understand the level of mind. I also have to understand the level of emotions. And if I want to say I'm logical by only addressing a mental construct, an idea, or an expression, but I don't look at what's actually happening in the spirit, I'm never going to understand it, because it's not something that can be figured out with the mind. It has to be figured out with the spirit. And we do that by tapping into our emotions or our intuition, right? So typically those who have a lot of feminine energy are usually a lot better at tapping into this source, right? So I would say some women are usually better at it, like women being more emotional, but it doesn't mean they're more irrational or act crazy or like are irrational. It just means that they have a faculty to feel these higher spiritual forces, experience, feel, see. They're typically more tapped into that, right? And then if you look at like the more masculine force, right? The more masculine force is like the mind. It's intellectual, right? It's intellectual. It's based in like physical observance of phenomena, right? But it doesn't understand. But we have to start understanding and recognizing spiritual energy, intellectual energy, and physical energy are connected. We have to stop seeing them as separate. And when you see them as separate, that's when it starts getting irrational. That's when it starts not making sense, right? And then that's why, for instance, like we talk about solving some problems, like for instance, like with the issue in Gaza, like that issue has been expounded out so badly that as human beings, the solution to it is actually quite simple because it's a spiritual one. Because in terms of all the policies, in terms of all the politics, all this stuff, all these modes of delivery, you're never going to solve all the issues that have happened or occurred there. You have to spiritually get to a place, and people have to spiritually get to a place where they're capable of forgiveness and allowing those systems to even occur. And then that'll happen. So for those who know, you know. For those who don't, if you lost, I'm sorry. Anyway, now that's creation. So creation is about building up to something, right? And being in that cycle. But we as a society don't express emotions, so creation gets stagnated, right? So this is why a very, very small percentage of people are actually able to be creative, because they are able to freely express their emotions, or you might call them emotional, and we call them artists, right? But it doesn't mean they're not logical. So in order to talk about the logic of emotions, you actually have to know what emotions are. So this is probably the juice of what everybody wants. And so we're going to talk about emotions as based in the Hawkins scale as we move up, because your emotions basically designate where you are on your vibration, and that's going to designate the level of reality you're creating, right? So you're just always going to match with things that have an inherent signature based off of those emotions, right? So at the bottom here, we're going to have shame, we're going to have guilt, and we're going to have fear. Then we're going to move on to anger. Or actually, no, I forgot. There's a really important one. Desire. Desire is really important. Desire, then we're going to have anger over here. Then we're going to have pride. Then you're going to have courage. Then after courage, you're going to have neutrality. You're going to have willingness. Reason, acceptance. Then once you start stepping into these higher emotions, right, these are like the ones that exist in like the spirit, right? You're gonna have things like joy, love, peace. Right up here. This is where those exist. And so, if you want to explain it this way, fear, guilt, and shame, those are the emotions that are most built with survival and that are based in like sort of just lower vibration, like lower vibration. But this is all relative and this is not bad, right? But this is based in survival. And these are feelings of consumption. So when we're at the lower end of the cycle, that's when things need to be consumed. So I'm going to give you an example of how emotional logic would work. Let's say in the cycle of life or whatever, I want to get rid of a certain element. Now this is going to be pretty messed up, but I'm just going to like kind of cut to the chase here. So let's say I want to get rid of a certain element. So let's say there's a guy named Johnny. There's Johnny all the way over here. I don't like Johnny. I want to get rid of him. I'm the universe. I want to get rid of Johnny. I want to consume him so I can put him as energy into another unit, right? This is just completely completely moral, right? Amoral. It's just what it is. So I don't like Johnny. I want to consume Johnny to get rid of him, and Johnny's just living his life or whatever. For survival of the universe, I've decided he's not adding enough value, so I just want to get rid of him, right? So in a completely amoral way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bombard him with feelings of shame, guilt, and fear, right? Because that will push him into survival mode. If that pushes Johnny into survival mode, right, that means he's going to slow down. He's going to feel things like depression. And he's going to start slow down and he's going to have thoughts like depression, and he's just going to feel really, really trashy. He's not going to feel good because he's in shame, guilt, and fear. And so I'm going to tell him thoughts to reinforce that shame. Recognize the feeling came first. Remember, because we're cutting from that fundamental aspect of being, because Johnny, remember, is spirit, mind, and then body. So I tell his spirit to feel shame, and I just start sending him shame. Now Johnny doesn't know that Johnny has the complete ability to choose whatever he wants, but I'm a spirit that wants to consume Johnny's energy. And so now I'm going to send him, and I'm a lower energy spirit. I live in this lower vibration, and I want to consume him because I get energy from him. I'm a parasite, right? I'm a parasite. So I live in very low, and I live in a contracting space, a space that contracts. And because it contracts, I'm very, very small. And I want to grow, but I don't know how to, so I take energy from other things that come in. But Johnny is too big. He's this giant, huge magnetic field, because naturally, when he was born, he was a third degree or fifth dimension. So fifth density, fifth dimensional being a human being spirit, and then third degree being with law, third degree law. So he's naturally filled with love, joy, and peace. So I can't consume him like that. I'm a little ant, he's a giant elephant, but I want to eat him. So me and my ant buddies, we're all going to get around, and we need him to slow down. So we're going to slowly poison him with thoughts of shame. We're going to make him forget who he is, or make him feel bad. And then when he starts feeling bad, he's going to start feeling shame. And that's going to be the feeling. He's just going to feel shame. So he's going to feel constriction in his heart. He's going to feel like he's not worthy. His brain's going to get really constricted. And so now he's going to have thoughts of how he's worthless. And then while thinking he's worthless, because now this is the thought, he's going to think he's worthless. He's thinking, I need to get rid of myself. Because he's in a system where he needs to be worthy. He's not worthy around him, so he needs to get rid of himself. You guys see where this is going? So eventually what happens is Johnny thinks these thoughts long enough, right? Until eventually his body begins to react by slowing down, getting depressed, sleeping all day. These are the symptoms. Now he can't get a job, so he's got no money. And girls don't like him, so he's got no hoes. and he's just a lonely dude. Just sucks. Life sucks for Johnny. So he's like, you know what? I don't want to do this life thing, so I'm going to delete. I'm going to self-delete. And then these are the actions his body takes. This, what I said, this chain of events is what is called emotional logic. So shame triggers in us when we sense that we are not enough and we are not loved. These are the twin terrors. The twin terrors. I talked about them in another video. I'll put that card up here. Talked it in the video. I can't even remember what the video was about. But I talked about them in another video. I'll put that card up there. But basically, he's now going through in his body the twin terrors, and he's feeling guilt, shame, and fear. So maybe fear that he won't ever do anything, guilt because of all the things he does because he's got no money, he's got no hose, and then he feels shame. And he's just going down, down, and down. What happened is that he contracts. He begins to not want to live, he gets depressed, he starts sleeping in, he just starts having slowly constricted actions because here he does feeling shame. And the secret to making sure this works is I have to make sure he doesn't acknowledge his spirit. The secret is if you want to stay in these, acknowledge and pretend like you don't have a spirit. That's the secret. Stay in your head, never let that energy flow. Stay in your head. And then you stay in your head and then never acknowledge your body either. Because if you go into your body, right, then you might be able to feel stuff and that's when it happens. So the idea is they need all these suppressed emotions to push with more and more and more and more pressure. Because you'll have an emotion and when you don't express it, the emotions just begin to push and pile up. But imagine these giant objects, like these giant boulders, because emotions and like the higher level emotions like peace, love, joy, they're very, very big objects, right? So they need to be in a very, very large consciousness. And so when they push down with all their weight and you have a small container, and instead of being the ocean like we're meant to be, we turn into a swimming pool or we turn into a small cup. These large emotions crush us, right? A boulder makes a ripple in the ocean, barely does anything, like a boat. But when you try to put it in a teacup, it'll crush the teacup. And so what happens is when we feel these emotions, they're trying to reduce our consciousness. And when we reduce our consciousness, we begin to then feel this constriction. And you might be like, well, what's the point of this shame? That is the point. Shame is trying to set you down to get rid of you because it is based in consumption. It is based in survival and lower vibration. And so the reason you are feeling that is because the whole point of that emotion is so that you are being prepared to be consumed. And you may be like, consumed by what? Remember, right? There are entities that exist without bodies and they want your energy, right? Or there might be people who have bodies, like human beings, like a girlfriend who makes you feel ashamed, a boyfriend who makes you scared all the time, a giant corporation, giant governments that want you to feel shame, that want you to feel guilt, that want you to feel shame so they can consume you. And that's the whole point. You're food. That is the role. So the reason you are feeling these things is because you are being prepared for food, because it is based in survival. And that is the logic. And so you might be like, well, okay, why am I feeling these things? Because you are being prepared for food. That's not who you are. You are not meant to feel those things. But you're feeling those things because something wants to eat you. So it is poisoning you. Just like when I drink poison or I eat food that's not good for me, I begin to feel slower, I begin to feel sick, right? That's what's happening within your emotions. So if you're like, well, I feel shame, I feel worthless, yeah, because you're being consumed. You are being prepared for consumption. And it's, well, what is trying to eat me? Think about that. If you are feeling these emotions and they are predominant in your life, you need to ask yourself, what is trying to eat you? What wants your energy and is trying to eat you and why? And you need to start looking at the people around you. You need to start looking at the environments you're in, because without knowing it, you might be in a food pen, an emotional food pen. And this is where you need to start growing awareness. And so what's interesting is that as we begin to grow awareness, and we're like, well, I don't want to be food, right? I don't want to be food. I want to be more. I'm more than that, right? I'm not just gonna let someone eat me and crush me to death. That makes me angry, Oni. I can't believe you said that. Oh, that's so upsetting, right? Okay. Now you're still in survival mode, but now you're in a different mode of survival. You're now in what is called fight or flight, because you're no longer food, right? You're no longer food down here, right? Now you're prey. You're prey. And you might be like, well, I'm prey, so I'm fight or flight. Because your survival instincts are kicking in. And you're like, well, I'm worth more than that. I don't want to be food. I want to figure out who I am. I want to figure out my destiny. Okay. So now you're feeling things like desire, anger, and pride. Now, desire is this idea of wanting something. Like you see that really, really smoking hot girl, and you're like, God, I want her so bad. I just want her so bad, and you chase after her, and you go through, and you do all these things. Or that car you want, and you're just like, man, like I want to go and do it or whatever. The idea of desire is to get you to start moving. You're in fight or flight. You're still in basically high cortisol, high stress. But now you're moving. And so now you're going to move into anger, you're going to move into pride. And you're going to start getting angry because you're going to start realizing at some point, anger is a signal that your boundaries were violated. And that you have been out of alignment, meaning you're not stepping into your full creator mode. So that you've been out of alignment, and that you are moving from this place of being consumed, that now you're trying to move into this place of being a creator, right? And so these emotions of desire, anger, and pride. So if you're watching it and you're like, I'm angry all the time, yeah, it's because right now you're in fight or flight, which means you are fighting something or you're running away from something, which is fine. But you have to recognize when you feel anger, do not push that back down into fear, because if you push that back into fear, now you're in survival mode again. Now you're being food. And a lot of people will go through this cycle because they won't accept their anger. And pride is thinking, hey, I might be better than people. I'm better than this. I'm better. I'm prideful. Like you start getting full of yourself, right? Which is fine, because once again, that's the emotion, that's the logic of the emotion you're experiencing, because it's trying to get you out of being prey. It's trying to get you out of being prey. It does not want you to be food anymore, right? And now we're going to start moving into this higher consciousness, right? Not quite high consciousness yet, because we're still just getting by. And this is actually the most dangerous part, because a lot of people think this is the end, because we live in a super masculine society where now you step into courage, where now you're stepping into courage and you're being neutral. And then you might be willing to do something. You reason, and then you have acceptance of things. You start seeing and accepting things as they are, right? Now, if you're in this level of vibration, but you're still living on a lower acceptance of law, you are now going to become a predator. And this is still a contentious paradigm, right here. This is still a contentious paradigm. Because now being a predator, and it doesn't necessarily, well, I don't know if the word predator is going to do that. So predator, I'd say really only move at here. But once you start getting into the acceptance, actually we're going to put acceptance as blue, right? Because I think there's a big jump here, acceptance. Right? Because now you're having the emotional logic of courage, neutrality, willingness, and reason. And the idea here is that you're now stepping into a creative paradigm. But it's still, the reason I say it's a creative paradigm, but it's still at a loss, is because you still, at this level, need to understand that not everything is win. There's still this idea of win-lose. Like there's losers and there's winners, but now you're winning because you have the ability to think. You have the ability to witness. You have the ability to reason. You have the ability to move through the environment without reacting through this emotional suppression, because people down here suppress their emotions a ton, right? And they're not expressing any of them. People up here have found better mechanisms or way to express their anger or express their emotions. Maybe not in the raw way, but they figured out how to express them in a way that is societally acceptable, which allows them to become more powerful representatives within the society and allows them to move up, right? And this is, once again, is about emotions. This is not necessarily where you are in your life, right? This is just about how you feel. And so the idea is that when you're in this level of vibration, you typically move into a predator. And you might be like, well, what do you mean? Like, yeah, most people, I would say 80% of the world, first off, I would say like 80% of the world is in prey or food. They're prey or food. That is how they are thinking and being. I would say about 15% of the world is here, where they're just in predator, win, lose. And this is why you have the people who are like, we hate the elites, and they're eating on us, and we're running from them, and we're fighting them, and this is our predator. So this is the dimensions of things like politics, religion, things like that. Things that just naturally create contention, and these spaces where it's win-lose paradigm, right? Where the predator is the one where you're trying to look and you're generally competing for resources, right? It's still this idea of competing for resources. And that, once again, is closer to creator. That's in higher alignment than this stuff. But once again, that's not full expression. That's not fully what we're meant to be. And so naturally we have this predator, we have prey, we have survival. And then finally, I feel like I should have given more space for this, because this is about expressing your emotions healthily and in fullness, right? Which also comes with all your creation. So then obviously we have here, at the very top, we have creator. And a creator thinks win-win, is expansive, and generally lifts everybody else up. Now, once again, this is not necessarily about hierarchy or where you sit. There's plenty of people who have peace, love, and joy, and they're homeless and they're living on the bottom of hierarchies. But it's that they generally have expansive emotions, they lift everyone up, and that they freely express themselves, right? And so when you're in this place emotionally, you're going to experience more acceptance, more love, more peace, because you're freely expressing what and who you are. But once again, just because this is how you feel doesn't necessarily mean that's how it's going to translate in your life. But this is emotional logic. Emotional logic. So a lot of times people don't understand emotions that are being expressed are going to tell you the subtext of people. So for instance, if I'm with someone and they are complaining a lot, I know they're here. Prey, fight, or flight. I know that, they're complaining a lot, they're talking shit on a lot of people, they're not very happy, I know they're here. I know that if someone is, for instance, talking a lot about like trauma, or is like, I'm healing and I'm trying to figure it out, they're moving from here to here. They're usually in between. A lot of people who are like, I'm spiritual, I'm so uplifted, they're usually vacillating between predator and prey. Most of the time. They work on like this paradigm of codependency and they're vacillating between here, right? When people start talking about expansive and they start living in peace, love, and joy, people who are living in peace, love, and joy don't talk about living in peace, love, and joy most of the time. They just talk about things that give them joy, that make them love, and they accept things as they are, and they're quite at peace, right? And so most of the time, they're just expressing and talking about things that make them feel happy, and they're just experiencing those emotions freely, and they're able to express that. And that's the emotional logic. The emotional logic is about giving you a litmus test of how in alignment you are. And that is what emotions are meant to do. And that's what happens when we express things. That's why some people say it's not what you say, it's how you say it. They're talking about the emotional logic. Because sometimes when we say things, we might say, I said that because I wanted to be loving. The words might have been loving, but the words were coming down here because the vibration was to make the person feel shame or guilt or fear. And you can feel that when they're like, I'm saying all these nice things, but emotionally you can tell that, no, you weren't trying to help me feel loved. You were trying to help me feel shame. And then we can have other things where we feel that, wait, this person said this thing that might have been difficult. It's just like when friends call each other swear words and they insult each other. On the words on the surface might look like they're based in shame, like, hey, you mother effer, or something like that. But really, at the end of the day, they're expressing love. right? And we might have other things like that. So like, oh my God, you're so hot. Or like someone who's your frenemy, they might express something that might appear to be loving on the surface, but underneath you can tell there's this sense of pride or anger here because they might feel like prey and they might see you as a predator, right? And so ultimately, this is like emotional logic. This is like how emotions are deciphered. So if you're ever like being like, what are my emotions trying to tell you? They're trying to tell you where you're at. And so if you feel things like fear, guilt, and shame a lot, and you're like, I'm very fearful, you're food. You're being consumed by something, and you've been prepared to get food, to get eaten by something, and that you are being consumed, right? And that you are being prepared to be consumed. And so if you want to get out of that, you have to start moving towards what you want. You have to start feeling anger, and you need to start having more self-respect, pride in yourself. And that's how you're going to move into fight or flight. And you're going to start moving. You're going to start having some type of action, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it will be the right action. Let's beyond that. But at least you're moving up the scale. And then eventually, whatever the thing you need to do, the thing you need to be courageous about, the decision you need to make, you're going to flip. And then you're going to move into a place where you're able to start moving and acting in the world, and you can start having an influence. And the reason I say predator here is because that's often how you're going to be seen at from prey. Fundamentally, your goal when you get here is not to stay here. If you're like, oh, reasoning and willingness and neutrality, like that's the way to go, I'm the crown joy, then yeah, you are fundamentally a predator. You're always going to think and act in paradigms where it's win-lose and based in competition. And you're always going to crush other people, the prey and the food, so that you can win. And so in order to do that, you have to move into a higher level of acceptance of who people are and what they are. And then then you'll start feeling things like joy, love, and peace. And if you're saying like, well, are you saying that if I'm a predator, I can't feel love? You can only feel love in proxy, but you'll never be able to feel it in its fullness. The best way to explain it, it's like someone getting their water supply from Coca-Cola their entire life. Like they technically had water, sure, but can you say that anything they've drank or anything they've shared is water? No, because they've been drinking Coke their whole life. And there is water in Coke, but that is not water. There's water in Coke, but there's not Coca-Cola in water. And so what I mean is that you can have bits and traces of love within reason, willingness, and all this, there's pieces of love in that. But that in and of itself is not love. It's something else because it's been tainted by all these other elements that come from consumption, a misalignment. And so in order to feel pure love, true love, you need to find alignment. And when you feel true love, you will know it. You will know it when you feel love. You will know it. And then when you're from that place, you will start being able to move into full creation. You will have flow. And being able to stay and live here in this way of being, that's what creates everything. And that's the emotional logic of those emotions. And so love naturally creates connections amongst loves. Joy, peace, that they naturally are expansive and lift everyone up. That's the logic. And that's what happens when we express them. So when we express pain, right, what's happening when people are expressing pain, what's happening is that's an ejection of the elements that are opposite of love. So oftentimes when people are expressing pain, they're telling you all the ways they have not felt loved, right? So it's like, I hate it when you do this, I hate it when you do that. What they're trying to tell you how they want to feel loved, but you have to be able to move through all these emotions in order to get there. So if they express their pain through shame, you know it's because they feel like they're food and they feel like they're being consumed by something, right? If they express their pain through anger, you know that, okay, they're in fight or flight. So the best way to assert this is don't let this person fight you or don't let this person run from you. And so first off, flight means that if someone is running from you, stop chasing them because that's going to trigger this in them, right? Don't run from them. And if someone is fighting you, don't fight them, let them hit you. That's what Jesus was saying when he was saying turn the other cheek and love your neighbors, all right? He wasn't saying be a pushover, but what he's saying is that when people express these emotions, the best way to help them move up the scale is that you have to be able to negate these two functions. Keep them from fighting you, keep them from flying you, and then eventually they will experience courage. And when they experience courage, then they can come to a place of neutrality. Now you can have a conversation with them. And when you have a conversation with this person, they'll be more willing to listen to you. And when they listen to you, they'll be able to reason what you're saying because now they're in a place where they can actually listen, right? And they're still going to be in a competition mode, but you're not going to incite that in them because you're just going to keep expressing your love for them. And if you do that long enough, eventually they will begin to accept it. And you'll know they'll accept it when they start feeling joy. And once they start feeling joy, you have them. They're cooked, right? They're done. Because then they can start co-creating with you. And then we can start being co-creators here. Because we're always creating, but we create a lot of this nonsense because we're always chopping up our love into little pieces so that we can fit it into the small expansiveness of our consciousness. But rather than chopping love up into smaller parts, we need to grow our consciousness to accommodate it, right? And that's the logic of emotion. That's how emotional logic works. And so it's based off this idea of, am I creating something or am I trying to consume something? Am I trying to eat them? And that's really, it comes down to these two things. Whenever you're having a conversation, whenever you're like, oh my God, this is emotional. All right, rather than judging it, you need to ask yourself, and right now, am I being a predator or am I being prey or am I being food? Right? And does this person think they're a predator, prey, or food? Right? Especially if you're using emotional in this sense of the negativity, this is probably how you're thinking, right? And there's a lot of people who think win lose. And so, for instance, if someone is coming at you as a predator and they're like da 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 da, you need to ask yourself, what am I trying to make this person feel with what I'm trying to say? And you might be like, well, I'm just being logical, da 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 da. If you're just doing that and you're like, well, I'm just being logical, I'm just being so smart, you're in pride. If you think like, oh yeah, I'm just being smart, they don't get it, understand, you're just in pride, right? That's what it is. And that emotion you're feeling of like, I don't have to care about people, da 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 da, that's just pride. And that means you still feel like a prey. And this is often what happens at that threshold, is there's a lot of people who stay at pride and stop at pride. And they think they're neutral, they think they're willing, they think this, but in reality, they just lack courage. And I think, this is my personal opinion, and this is a loaded statement, but I think people here, these are cowards. Because when you're very prideful and you're at the end of this prey journey, but you're not willing to take the step into courage, you're just a coward. And yeah, there's a lot of people there now. There's a lot of people, the smart, educated, really know everything they're talking about is a pride. And I know, even me even talking about that, I'm starting to give off that vibe now, even me talking about it. So this is where it's super important that where we focus, because when I focused on this, then I start sounding like them, right? Because now I'm dipping into that energy. And so this is where it's like being present. We got to start talking about lifting people up and trying to find this, stay grounded and rooted in these emotions and have the awareness of where we're at in the emotions, right? And so emotional logic, often to find it, you'll find it within the interaction itself. You will never have to spend or grow outside of that interaction. So let me check, make sure that we're still rolling. And then like, to give you an example of like how best to work through a fight, for instance, so like if, so now that we understand this, if someone like, for instance, you have a friend who's in shame, right? And they're just like for instance, a lot of people who are suicidal, once again, food, that's food talk. If someone's like, I got suicidal ideation, okay, they're in food talk. That means their predominant emotion, their vibration is predominantly guilt, fear, and shame, right? So in order to help that person, you want to figure out what it is they want and what makes them angry, right? And so usually if that person, and usually when this person is coming out of that, they're going to bitch and whine and complain and be angry. But recognize that as good, because at least they're not sitting in their bed waiting to die. And then what happens is when they go into that anger or that pride, they might start moving into this big like, oh shit, I think I'm better than people, da 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 da. They're going to have that. That is part of them growing. You need to understand the emotional logic of, if someone is suicidal and now they think they're better than all these people, you've just helped them raise up the scale. It might be draining for you, yeah, because they're going to pull you down from wherever the heck you are, right? But if you're going to try not to move like a predator, because the thing is, most of the time when they're a predator here, this is where you start getting this this conflict, is that at some point the person starts being too neutral, and the person here starts being stuck in pride, and nobody's being courageous. Courage is like the most important emotion, right? Because it's it's the last negative emotion and it's the first positive emotion. Like you move into neutrality. The first real positive emotion is acceptance, right? But courage is what creates that bridge, right? And so courage, this point of courage is literally, that's why we have so many movies about it. That's why it's the point of all these stories. Courage, if you're like, what's the one emotion I need to master processing and moving through? Being courageous. If you want to help people or you want to help yourself, you need to be courageous. You need to do shit that you are scared to do and do it anyway. Being courageous. Because if you can figure that out, you're going to either move people right up the scale or you're going to shoot them right back down. Because then after that point, courage is about choice. Sure, courage is about choosing, right? And whatever that choice looks like, we can talk about more about that. But in terms of like the emotional logic, this is where it is. Just, are they food? Are they being ready for consumption? Are they prey? Still in consumption. But then, oh, now are they working more towards creation, where they're being more of a predator, but they're trying to create something for themselves, versus now pure creation, where you're accepting love, peace, enlightenment, all that stuff, where you're in flow. If you want to be an artist and you want to like be really productive and stuff, you need to learn and figure out, how do I stay in these emotions and work from this basis, and what are the elements of my life that are needed for that. And so this is emotional logic. This is the logic of emotion. This is how emotions work. And so when people are like, oh, this person's being emotional, oftentimes it's because you're not paying attention to understanding what the emotion is. So so if I want to give you guys like the example, remember, all emotions are just to express and move towards alignment, because you're just always trying to move towards alignment or out of alignment, right? And so you need to ask yourself, is this person trying to move towards alignment or away from alignment? Because it is a choice. And you don't want to think of it as binary in the nuance, but honestly, it is that binary. It is, are they moving towards alignment? Or are they moving away from alignment? And it's really that simple. Towards alignment, away from alignment. So, and then once you know that, you have to ask yourself, is the emotion, is what they're saying trying to move me down the scale? And most of the time, if someone is saying something and they're trying to shame you, that's them telling you, hey, they're trying to move me away from my alignment. If they're trying to say some things and move you up the scale towards courage or willingness, then you know they're trying to move you into alignment. And it's as simple as this. If you want to feel better about your life, find people who are trying to move you into alignment. If you want to feel trashy about your life, find people who are going to move you away from your alignment. It's that simple, right? And then just always figure out, what kind of conversation am I having, and being present without emotions. And then usually you're just going to find whatever you're looking for there. And yeah, that's really it. That's emotional logic in a nutshell. So if you guys have any questions, please put that down in the comment section, as well as I help people who want to learn how to master these types of principles in their life to live a more fulfilling life, specifically high-performing corporate people, entrepreneurs, etc. So please hit me up on my scheduling link if you need that out, and I hope to see you guys on the flip side. Peace, love, and take care.